On behalf of the campus and all the community members, I do welcome everyone to the 37th edition of the Archives Public Lecture Series. Suchitra and I have been speaking about this for a few months, and I'm so glad that she could make it, and also so thrilled that Rajshekhar has also agreed to join us for this conversation. And we played around a little bit about thinking about what the structure is. And as many of you would see from the link in the chat window, the lecture series is really a space to sort of connect people from various disciplines around their body of work and have a conversation with them about what they have done, but also to look for people from, say, from lawyers, from students, scientists, journalists, artists, and of course, academics. Suchitra's talk is titled People Make Their Own Map, and it's looking at citizenship and belonging in South Asia. My job is relatively simple today. I'm just going to introduce Suchitra and Rajshekhar, and they're going to take this conversation over. But before I do that, just a couple of quick just notes. One, if this is the first time you're attending these lectures, we do encourage you to go check out the two links that we've put in the chat. One is the link to the archives itself, which is a public research center. We're unfortunately not open right now due to the current circumstances, but we do entertain any research questions that you might have, and we can service them online if you have access to the internet. So do have a look at that. It's a public space for the history of contemporary biology. And if you're interested in any of the past talks, the link for that is also there, and all the past recordings are accessible on the web for you to look at. And so feel free to share those two things. Suchitra was born and raised in Chennai. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, GQ, the Boston Review, the Hindu, and Foreign Policy. She's a barrister by training and previously worked for the United Nations War Crimes Tribunal in Yugoslavia and Rwanda before co-founding the Resettlement Legal Aid Project in Cairo, which gives legal aid to Iraqi refugees. She's an award-winning photographer and the founder and executive director of the Police Project, a hybrid research and journalism organization. She'll be speaking to M. Rajshekhar, a journalist whose recent book, Despite the State, which was published by Westland in 2021, is an examination of pervasive state failure and democratic decay in India. His work has won a number of awards, including the Ramnath Goenka Excellence in Journalism Award and 4 Shriram Awards for Excellence in Financial Journalism. Suchitra and Rajshekhar, thank you so much, and over to you.
Right. Venkat, thank you for this. Hello, everyone. It's really good to be here. As Venkat was saying, to borrow his words, my work today is also pretty simple. I'm not going to sort of talk about Midnight's Borders too much. This is Suchitra's book. It seems superfluous. The author is with us. She should talk about it. I wanted to talk about why Suchitra Vijayan is a voice that I take seriously. I'm a reporter. I write relatively investigative stuff and so on and so forth about how this country is functioning and whatnot. And as a reporter, when we sort of look for editors we want to work with, or peers we want to work with, we essentially look for 2 qualities in them. The first has to be a sort of intellectual clarity, that they're able to see what is going on, discard all the noise, and narrow down to the essence of what is really unfolding. Our failure to do this resulted in the great misclassification of the Gujarat model, which haunts us today. Right. The second quality that all of us reporters, particularly, I suppose, look for is, apart from intellectual clarity, is that it must be accompanied by a spine to be able to sort of call out, speak fearlessly about what it is that we are seeing right now. And from where I stand, having known Suchitra for 5 years, I mean, it's incredible. I just realized that I've known her for 5 years now. Having seen her work, Police Project's work, consistently, Suchitra has been one of the sharpest minds parsing how the Indian state is mutating, what it is after, and what it is doing to us. And I'm really happy, to essentially be here to listen to her. And with that, one last thing. Suchitra will speak for about 15 minutes on Midnight's Borders. I have a couple of questions about how our state and how our society are responding to COVID. And then we open for general questions. Okay, over to you, SV.
Venkat, folks at the archives at NCBS, thank you for organizing this, hosting this, and making space for all of these conversations. And I don't think we should underestimate these conversations, because in a time when everyone feels a bit lost, conversations are not only a way of forming community, but it's also one of those million mutinies that we can have in our own living room. So thank you so much for that. Rajshekar, again, thank you so much for that. Overwhelmed. I'm quite overwhelmed by the introduction, but also thank you so much for being here. The things that you said today also refer to you in terms of the in-depth reporting, thinking through, but also thinking about the larger issues. Today is an interesting time to talk about this, because since the moment Venkat reached out and we've been talking about this, sometimes it feels like an entire epoch has passed, given what's happening with the COVID second wave in India, with the absolute dismantling and bringing our entire institutions to a standstill, to the sheer scale of violence and death. When I say violence, I'm not talking about violence in the sense that we think in terms of blood and gore, but the sheer bureaucratic violence and the violence that can be created in the absence of a state. But also globally, we are seeing what's happening in Palestine. There is much that's happening in other parts of the world, less off the news, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's Yemen, Syria, and also within Europe, the kind of crisis that's emerging. So what we're really seeing is a crisis of citizenship and ways in which people think and form communities. So it's in some ways an important and a remarkable time to have this conversation. So thank you for having this. I'm just very quickly going to share this. So the book starts with an image of Afghanistan-Pakistan border. It starts with this quote that says, it starts with an image and a quote from Commander Mahmood, who was a member of the Afghan local police in Paktika province in Afghanistan. You might wonder, why does a book about India start with Afghanistan? But that's something that you will discover over the course of this talk. It starts with something that he says. I was in Afghanistan much before I started this project on India and traveling through India's borders. And one of the first things that really stuck to me from this conversation was this. When Commander Mahmood told me that it's the colonizers' map, they had no respect for our land. Why should we respect their borders? The book starts with this. And once you, for those of you who have the book, and the second thing that you will see is the book also starts after the image, soon after you have a prologue. The prologue starts with a comment, when someone asks my name, I say I'm someone who has lost my home many times over. This is a quote from the fieldwork that I did in the India-Bangladesh border. And I kind of want to start with laying out these two quotes. One, it's the colonizer's map. They had no respect for our land. Why should we respect their borders? And then with a quote that says, when someone asks my name, I say I'm someone who's lost my home many times over. One happens, a conversation that happens in Paktika province, which the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, where I was embedded with the US forces. And the second conversation happens almost 2.5, 3 years later in the India-Bangladesh border. From a gentleman who tells me a story of not only multiple violences, but loss that's happened to him and his family over and over again. So today's conversation is about people make their own maps. People make their own maps is also in some ways the story of this book. What are these maps? How do we think about these maps? And why are these maps important? Yesterday, when I was talking to Rajshekar, one of the things he said is that a good way to think about this conversation is also to tell what, why, and what are the arguments in the book. And I'll start with the why first, and then go to the what and the arguments in the book as a way to kind of think through and think about some of these conversations. As I started my young life, or my life as a thinking adult, 9/11 happened. I had just left high school. And one of the things that you constantly heard was the ways in which the word terrorism, Islamophobia, radicalization, all were getting weaponized to try to make sense of what had happened. I was growing up in an age of dystopia in which I wasn't sure. I didn't have the literary skills, I didn't have the critical faculties to think about what was happening. What you really saw was the ways in which not only what happened in 9/11 remake the United States, an empire, into a more aggressive policing empire, not that it wasn't doing all of that, but also ways in which this rhetoric affected the world, not only in Afghanistan, Pakistan, in India, and other parts of the world. One of the things that I've always wanted to do is to return to Afghanistan, because as a young person, I always wondered. I remember there was this one op-ed that I read in the diplomatic version of the Times used to have a diplomatic edition for Europe, and it said it called Islamabad and Kabul the terror hotbeds. My first concern was, how is it that entire cities could now be turned into terror hotbeds? What does it mean? Does it mean that a city of a few million people were all terrorists? What does this language mean? But also, what does it mean to think about violence and resistance and how these things play out when we think about a community and the way the community remembers itself? Whose violence are we talking about? Is it the violence of the empire with its standing armies? Or is it the people trying to defend themselves? And some of these questions are playing out today when we see the whole question of what's happening in Palestine, the occupied territories, and what the Israeli state is doing. And you see this with Kashmir, you see this with any of the violence that's playing out. Often the conversation turns. So these questions are not new. So these were questions that I've been living with for a really long time. And once I got to Afghanistan, again, when I got to Afghanistan, I get to Afghanistan almost 10 years after 9/11. And I got there as a lawyer, but by this time I'd already been a lawyer, and I was in Yale as a graduate student. And my question that I went there with was actually an incomplete question. This goes back to Rajshekar's thing about sometimes you need to ask the right questions in order for us to get the right answers. The question that I went to Afghanistan with was a question about, why is it that the world's largest territorial army that had 2010 already spent $13 trillion not able to fight or win the war, essentially made of a ragtag and sergeant group? That's how they were described, a ragtag and sergeant group. And for me, one of the things that became very clear early on was that the question that I went with there was not right. Something else was happening. What I really saw was not an American empire going to war to avenge what happened to it. I saw an American empire trying to not understand the history, the local memory, and more importantly, not listen to the people on the ground. Often you would hear stories of American valor. New York Times archives are full of these images of Afghan soldiers going to war. You would see them in almost this Michelangelo-esque lighting of tattoos sitting, but you never quite saw the Afghans in all of this. You never really knew what was it that was happening, or what was it that was happening to these people. And once you got there, you realized that what you saw and what was being shown or telecast live was very different than what was actually happening on the ground. So once I got there, I had to change my question, because the question that I went there with was very incomplete. I also realized that after 10 years of being in what is now a never-ending war, a lot of the US forces in Afghanistan really didn't know what was happening. And one of the ways for me to understand counterinsurgency practices was to try and go to parts of Afghanistan that was not accessible to civilians. And one of the reasons I embedded with the US forces, again, it was very hard to have someone like me embedded, because I was not there as a photographer, I was not there as a journalist, I was a graduate student, I wasn't an American citizen, I was an Indian citizen. I was not the typical person you would find. I didn't look like your typical war photographer who was mostly European or white, who went into these places to tell the story of the American unit or the British unit. I was there to try and make sense of the people on the ground and what was happening to them. And once I got there, Paktika province is a bordered community. But Paktika province straddles a place where the borders are porous, people cross back and forth. And what you really saw was that the local history and memory was very different than the history that we are being taught. And that is true of many, many places, but that was something that was there over and over again. And I'm just going very quickly. So these are all, again, the first day of the embed, what happened was that this is the photograph taken from inside the US armed vehicle. And these are the problems with embedding process. These are the problem when you stand next to the state and you see outside. This is the view that one got. Not a perfect view, it's a distorted view. But then once I left the US NATO Forces unit, and again, by the time I got there, nobody cared enough to write about Afghanistan the way they had written about. I was in a remote Paktika province. There was nobody else who was embedded. And nobody also cared about these remote parts of the world, which meant that after the first few days, I was actually allowed to hang out with the local Afghan forces that worked with the NATO forces. When you come to these places, what you really saw here was this moment when this is the local Afghan army's command hold overlooking Pakistan. Again, in this place, you do not know where Afghanistan stops, where Pakistan begins. What you really see is not a weapon. What you really see is the barrel of a weapon that is kept there as a scene. Everything's a theater state. If tomorrow this command post is attacked, there's no way these Afghan men would be able to protect themselves. So then one again goes back and wonders, what really is soldiering? This is not the image that you would see on the front pages of New York Times. And yet of the $13 trillion that went in, what is it that actually made sense in terms of the community? This is what really went there. You didn't even have an actual gun that could shoot. You really had a fake old barrel that was placed there to give an illusion that there was something that was being protected. And again, these are views from one of Gulradin, which is one of the most difficult parts. It took about 4 months and many lost lives to carry. And this is the view of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. And I think this image is important to me. I think this is the moment when it became really clear that the door that you see is the route that you see below is route Jeep, but also beyond this, you did not know where Afghanistan ended and where Pakistan began. It was also a moment you realize that in my own analytical framework, I had expected to see an atlas-like figure where I would knew that this is where something began and something ended. But that's not the case. And in some ways, the stories, even when you traveled from one village to another, what became very clear very early on was that people here had a very different sense of history. For them, the Americans were just the most recent occupiers and colonizers of their land. There were conflicting ideas about how people thought about themselves, who was the fighter and who was the freedom fighter. Even within the freedom fighter, who was a freedom fighter and who has now become the terrorist. Today, tomorrow, the terrorist will become a warlord, will then go on to work with the same American forces that was once given money to annihilate your entire community. What you really saw was changing allegiances, mostly just people trying to live, fight, and survive, and fight for another day so that they can go on to think and speak about these things. These images don't, one of the reasons I'm also showing these images is because while the book starts with the Afghanistan-Pakistan chapter, a lot of these images don't appear in the book. These are again the kind of units, the ways in which, again, I want you to remember that this is not just a case of Afghanistan-Pakistan. Even as I traveled through India's borders and you saw our own fortifications, these are what war zones look like. They look like places put together to defend, but actually don't do the job of defending simply because eventually, no matter how many billions of dollars get invested, when men go to war, the men who go to war often are expendable. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to kind of stop with this image at this point in time and then make the transition. These were the equipments that were given to the men in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. After $13 trillion, what you really saw was beaten up trucks, right? These were men standing. This is all that they had. And again, looking at the US military, again, these were men who were supposed to work with the US military and go into fight this war on global war on terror that nobody knew who they were fighting anymore. But also tells you that the realities of war are often sad and lonely, but a lot of soldiering is also just waiting. And I think it's this moment that I kind of started wondering, and this was just a few days before I left. I really started wondering, what does it mean to think about war, but also citizenship and belonging, and also the question of what does it matter? How does it? What would we see if I did the same travels along India? What stories would we unearth? What conversations would we have? But also, what ways would we think about the world, and why is it important? This image does appear in the book, and I will kind of very quickly tell you a story about this young boy. Again, when you looked at the war itself, the American army by then had started using the Afghans as a way to recruit and fight the local war. By this time, they believed that it was a local problem and we had to recruit a local army, which meant that they started creating something called Afghan local police. So each village would have a fighting force recruited, trained by the Americans, who would then go on to fight the Taliban. But if, again, often who got recruited into these places were young boys like this. Often the ones who didn't have fathers who came from the lowest parts of um, the economic ladder, because the rich boys or the boys within the community who had resources either were sent off to India to study or Dubai to study. Again, within the societal structure that has broken down completely, it was young boys like this. Again, if you look at it, he's using the cartridge that is again reused and handed down to him. A lot of these boys used army uniforms that were handed down to him from the Americans. And then in his hand, you would see an M&M. He was barely 15. This would actually qualify as recruiting child soldiers to go to war. But this was not Congo. This was not the Lord's Liberation Army that was recruiting young boys. This was done by the local Afghans for money with the complicity of the US forces. And one of the things that this boy tells me when I'm having this conversation with him is that, his maternal cousin joined the Taliban and they said, they pay well for doing nothing. He had the gun first. And pointing to his own gun, he tells me, these guns are not bad either. So when training these young boys, all that they did was all of these boys would be picked up, taken to a place where they would hire local war commanders to train these boys again for a week or so. And then they would be given $100 a month, an AK-47, and sent off to fight the Taliban. Again, a lot of who we call Taliban are just people who are their cousins, people who live across the border. This is the image that I shot of the graduating class when I was there. Only some of them appear here, but if you look at it, a lot of them are young boys and men, if you look at the things here. And by the time the summer came, half of them had died, especially this young boy. Let's see if I can go back. By the time I came back, I called in the summer. The local interpreter told me that this boy had died. And I asked him, do you remember him? And he said, even the local Afghan interpreter didn't remember his name. He said, I don't remember his name. I only remember a photograph of him. I think it was that moment of leaving Afghanistan and realizing that the question that I went there with was absolutely flawed, that there's something else that was happening, that I really had to stay in that place to not ask questions, but to just witness what was happening, to understand the social worlds. That the idea came in which I was wondering, if I traveled the lengths and breadths, just as I had done of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, what would I find in India? And that's how the book was born. Initially, it was meant to be a visual project. It was not supposed to be a book. And then in the last 8 years, as I traveled, some of the things that became very clear and important to me was that, again, the questions that we were asking about citizenship and freedom and liberty, these large, grand questions, were not as grand. These were questions that people were dealing with every single day, confronting what it meant to think about this world, but also what does it mean to think about maps itself. When I say people make their own maps, It's not just the question of preserving their sense of history and community and passing it on. It is also trying to find a community that is not as alienating to them as it is to be a part of a nation state. One of the other questions that are very important in the book, and as you will see, is what does the function of a nation state? What function does a nation state provide in this time and age? What does it mean, especially if the nation state has consistently denied dignity to its people? Another thing that I really wanted to do with this book is not to write trauma porn. The idea was not to bear witness or tell their stories, because one thing you realize very early on is that those in India, especially those farthest away from power centers, farthest away from the legal systems, farthest away from even our sense of history and memory, are eloquent, articulate voices of their own predicaments, their violence, their histories. So I was not there to give voice to the voiceless. I was not there to tell their story because they are more than capable of doing that. What I was really there was to make sense of my social world, because I knew that when I started this work 2013, 2012, 13 in India, and as I worked through this to 2018, 19, India drastically transformed. How do we make sense of this transformation? To make sense of the transformation, one has to have a sense of history, but also what sense of history? A sense of structures and institutions, their failures, but also ways in which people confront these histories, these institutions, and ways for them to think through this. And one of the things that became very clear for me is that my job was not to write from a place of knowledge. I was writing from a place of not knowing. I am not a pundit. I am not the guy you would find on prime time telling you with absolute surety this is the case, or A plus B equals C. I came from a place where I really wanted to understand. Even in as early as 2013, I felt that the social fabric of the Indian Republic was crumbling down. The first time I spoke about the idea of the communities in India, the balkanization of India, or I'm trying to think of a better word to use, that even as early as 2013, I felt that the country was balkanizing. India's social fabric was already in a place where it was beginning to unravel. Of course, not as much as what has happened, but much of this was also placing this within the history, not just within the history of BJP or RSS or the current dispensation, but also longer history of how the Indian state itself has treated its people, especially those in the border regions. So how do we tell those stories? How do we make sense of those stories? So then the idea is not to make them into individual stories of violence or pain or hurt or humiliation, but rather use these stories as a way to critique the larger structures. It's always incredibly easy to look at someone who's gone through immense violence. And this happened when we were documenting the immigrant crisis. There were some stunning images that came out of the immigrant crisis. There were, and also you had some of India's most well-known journalists photographing them, putting a mic in front of them and saying, oh, tell us what was happening. And in some places, it felt that it became a trauma porn, where we were constantly looking at people who didn't have so much, who had been deprived of so much, were walking thousands of miles. And all that we did was we turned the lens on them and we tell them, demand that they tell us their story. Not that that is wrong, but once we've demanded that they tell our story, the lens also has to be turned back to the people responsible for the crisis. Why is it that that lens was not turned back? Why is it that thousands of people had to walk thousands of miles, in that process lost life, their dignity, a sense of who they were, absolute denial of their rights, in some cases not just erosion but denial? But why was that happened? Who was responsible for this? Can we name the beast that was responsible for it? Can we not only shed light on those damaged by this violence, but could we also turn the lens and ask who was responsible for this? Because then the question becomes, these individual stories then become stories that can help us think through the larger structures that are responsible. Structures and also larger, and also individuals who are responsible. And that ethnography of the powerful was something that was not being done. And in this book, the questions that I ask are very similar. Yes, this violence happened and this is traumatic, but it's not just trauma. Often the people in the book are also eloquently telling you what led to their trauma. They perhaps have far more political clarity and historical clarity in terms of what happened. They will tell you what happened. They will tell you the questions of analysis. They might not wear fab India kurtas and pull it up their hands and have that conversation. But even in their predicaments, they have excellent analysis of their social realities. Then these stories then become a way to make sense of that moment, but also critique the power. We need to look at the structures, we need to look at the history, and that is the only way for us to make sense. But then why? Then once we have told these stories, we've excavated these stories, we've talked about the larger historical sense, what then? One of the things that I ask in this book is, can we reimagine a better world? And this is not a hippy dippy question of, oh, this is a liberal left radical dispensation, these people are crazy, what do you mean different? And this is not a rhetorical question. This is not a question, because the world that we are living in right now is deeply unequal, it is deeply flawed, it is unjust, and we cannot continue living like this anymore. So that new world is already being born, whether you and I like it or not. It's being born in different ways. For instance, we can militarize our borders as much as we want, but as climate change happens, and I write this in the book, what standing army will you protect as water swallows land? What then happens to millions of people who will then be left homeless, landless, will be pushed to move? How do we imagine that world? Where will they go? What rights will they have? Who is responsible for them? And what communities will they build? And that is a reality. With COVID and the number of people dying, our communities are being completely remade. If the COVID mortality, if the mortality rates are true, we will lose more people than India lost in the Bengal famine, which means that entire communities will be remade. So that world is already here. So when that new world is already dawned, we have no choice but to find out ways to make it better. So the future is also thinking about, can we think of a better world remade of justice and equality, not as a rhetorical question, but that is something that is important for you and me. It is all well and fine when you and I are not victims of the system. But the moment we all become victims of a system, then death sees no caste, no class, no gender, no race. That world is already being remade. So, one of the questions I also ask in this book, which I hope we are able to think through, is what does it mean to think about freedom? Can we think about freedom outside the ideas of territorial sovereignty? Is there ways for us to remake and rethink the society in ways that are just and equal? And that comes back to the question of citizenship in South Asia. How do people think of citizenship? Who do they think of belonging? How do they think about belongings? And I'm going to finish with an anecdote that happened in 2010. So in 2010, I was about to start grad school at Yale, and then I had that summer left. And one of the things that I wanted to do, this was a time when the Sri Lankan state had um, Sri Lankan state had completely destroyed the resistance, the LTT resistance, brutal resistance. Large Tamil communities were held in these IDP camps. And I was talking to somebody at CPA in Sri Lanka. And one of the things that they said, having these conversations about all of these people living there, and this thing of asking people about what it meant to lose their state, the de facto Tamil state came up. And someone said something very interesting. They said, you know what, I think it's so important for us to have those conversations now and ask people what, because people will also change their stories. Because as the violence goes, as people have to figure out ways to be integrated into whatever society they will be forced to reintegrate into, people will also start changing their stories. Because changing the story is not an act of lying. Sometimes you have to change your story just to survive. Because that is a moment when histories are also get remade. So that's exactly so what's happening in India is that histories are being remade, rewritten. Ideas of aggression are being rewritten. And I think that's an important thing that I've always kept in my mind, that people also respond to their histories and memories as time goes on. As historical change dawns upon us, we also have to think about those things. With that, I'll kind of stop my conversation, and then we'll have this conversation with Rajshekhar and then open it up for more questions.
Okay, thanks, Esri. You ended by saying that histories are being rewritten, right, constantly. From where I stand, it seeing so much that a large chunk of this conversation is going to be about citizenship and the state in any case. It seems to me that the social contract between the state and the people is particularly being renegotiated right now, right? The subcontinent has never been a stranger to mass death, Bengal famine, the rights after partition, and so on. The thing with them is that in each of those, we could sort of lay the blame at some individual actor outside, right? Colonialism for the Bengal famine, the whole decision to partition India and Pakistan, for the riots that followed. But what we are seeing today, uh, with a mortality rate comparable to the Bengal famine and the partition, is a particular event of mass mortality where the only actor responsible is the Indian state. How do we understand something like this is my first question. And the second question, that we also know that the scars of partition stay with us today. And therefore, how does a society deal with trauma of this kind? I mean, this can be redemptive. We could learn our mistakes, or we could balkanize further. So these two things I wanted to understand from you. One, how do we begin to wrap our head around the fact that the state is directly responsible for this mass mortality program? And B, how do societies deal with something like this, the trauma of it? So,
I'm going to take the second one, right? With the partition again, the current numbers we have that 17.9 million people migrated, right? 17.9 million people. This was a study that was done at Harvard, where they went to kind of map the numbers, because we've never really had the real numbers, right? We don't even have the real numbers. We also don't have the real numbers of the Bengal famine. Now we are saying that the numbers could be much higher. Initial numbers were less than 1 million a few years ago. It came up to 3. Now I think the numbers were as high as 5 million. With the partition, 17.9 million people migrate. And the real cost of death is never taken into account, right? Yes, it was not the independent Indian state one would attribute culpability to, but there was a colonial state in place, right? And this is also where I think it's very important for us to understand that, and it's important in terms of how we tell our stories and redemption and all of that, is that India was ambushed halfway to freedom. We never truly got freedom in the real sense. And this is a book that I always refer to people, is that the conversations about freedom and what it meant for a colonial subject, a colonial nation, a community. I don't want to use the word nation, a colonial a community, various communities that were under colonial rule. What does it mean for them to get freedom? In Gary Wilder's book, Freedom Time, documents the conversation between two post-colonial intellectuals, Césaire and Senghor, in Francophone Africa, where they're having one a public intellectual, one a politician, are having these conversations. Tagore also has these conversations. India also, many of the activists and freedom fighters in India were also having these conversations in the early part of the century. But one of the questions that all of them speak and are absolutely concerned about is, what does freedom mean for us when the colony is dismantled, when the empire leaves? Are we going to think of freedom outside the limits of territorialism, territorial nationalism? Can we think of freedom outside the boundaries of nationalism? This is not a very radical idea. That sounds radical now, given how petty our minds have become, but these were conversations that were happening as early as the early parts of the century. And one thing that comes constantly again and again is all of them say that we cannot go the way the European nationalisms have gone. We cannot go the way of state-making process that the Europeans have done. We need to think outside nationalism. Of course, that never happens. And another thing that we have to understand is that India was never, there was a transfer of power. There was no real freedom. Second, India was, this was something that yesterday I forget the name of the professor. She was saying that India was not decolonized. From a colonial colony, penal colony, we were not decolonized, we were nationalized. And I think that had grave implications to the way that we not only told our stories, but it also denied us of ways to heal. Let's not forget that people killed each other and danced on their bodies, right? This is what my friend Asim Rafiki, who's also one of the members at Polis, says, is that he says, Suchitra, we killed our neighbors and we danced over their bodies. Now we cannot think of nostalgia for a home that we had complicity in destroying. And this is something that Asim says from someone who grew up in Lahore. So that sense of our histories either being only histories of immense violence or histories of nostalgia for a return to a home also inhibits us from thinking about state complicity. Because in this process of the way that we tell stories, we do not name the beast. We do not name the structures that were responsible for it for us to dismantle. We do not name the individuals responsible for it to hold them accountable. And that is now happening. And again, the partition is, and this is again, I say in the book, is incomplete, ongoing, and it hasn't stopped. The partition is happening in us, amongst us. Not only has political and socio-political realities, but also has individual stories. In the book, I quote a dear Pakistani friend who says that, Suchitra, you have no idea what it means to live under an authoritarian regime. Once you pack your suitcase and you leave your living room, it feels like there's always a metaphorical suitcase packed. No matter how many times you move, no matter how safe you are, how rich you are, you will always have your bags packed. There's always a metaphorical luggage and bags packed in your living room so that you know that this is not going to lose. So we have to think both in terms of the way we tell our stories and the way the state expects us to tell our stories and memories absolves the structures responsible and the people responsible, so there is no accountability or healing. And second, it also denies us of a certain kind of socio-moral political clarity. Now, why is this important? Because that's exactly what is now playing out in India. If I'm not mistaken, yesterday we had 3,874 deaths yesterday. We've had more than 250,000 people dead already. They say these numbers are underreported. Assuming even 250,000 people dead, imagine 200, I don't think we understand what that scale means. Now, going back to the sense of bodies, the state being responsible for the mass deaths, I actually want to revert this and say that states have always been terrorists. The first time the word terrorist is used in the French context to describe state terror. Of course, now the word terrorist is used to describe individuals, individual complicity, individual actors against something where we've completely outsourced responsibilities to individuals, right? An individual is radicalized, an individual does it, an individual's identity does it, his religion, his poverty, right? But in reality, if you look at the etymology of state, word terrorist, it starts with states. Within the French context of the French Revolution, the first terrorists, or the way you think of terrorism, is state terrorism. And states, whether you like it or not, whether they as monarchies, as feudal systems, have always just been responsible for mass deaths. It's just that the language we use to describe it is all over the place. It's a language of political science. It's a language of international relations, which means that we absolve states can always be absolved of the responsibility that they have. Now let's take examples. One of the things that, since you brought this question up, I went back and I looked at works on the Black Death and the plague. What does the plague do? The plague wipes out, people say, over 1/3 of the population. And it does two things. One, the rich become richer. which is again, you see how it, the rich become richer. The rich also start displaying their wealth in a specific way, so that they need to create social hierarchy, because the debts, while the rich become richer, the social death also means that peasants have died. There are not enough people to work the land. So the peasants' contract with the land disintegrates. So you don't have so many people willing to work for you for nothing. The feudal system in some ways begins to disintegrate. So peasants are now revolting. They are now going to cities. They are telling you that we need more money. So social hierarchy, the class system begins to break down. And just as a class system begins to break down, the richer, then start dressing in more pageantries, right? Because they want to make sure that they are still the more powerful. The second thing it does is that the state then becomes responsible for managing the revolt. Of course, the state then is a monarchical state. It's not the state as we think of it. But it's also around the same time that we start hearing stories about the social contract. What is a social contract? How does the relationship between the citizen and the state work? So here, the monarchy, or the people responsible for managing what the crisis, also the ones who are responsible for the crisis. Because if you look at the research that's being now done that comes out of the plague and every other natural calamity, Anthropocene calamity, is that it was a state that was responsible. It happened because the state, whether it was a monarchy, whether it was a feudal system, whether it was the colony, they were absolutely responsible. The leadership failed to act on time, failed because they hoarded. Again, the modern day comparisons are uncanny. Another thing that they do is, once the state has failed and caused all this death, the state then does what the state has always done. It manages the revolt of the peasants who want more money, who want more resources, who want more access, crushes the revolt, and rewards the monarchy that has already made more money. And that has real consequences to the ways in which the European nation state formation happens, the way in which colony and colonialism then kind of plays out. So there is an effect. So what happened in the plague has repercussions as of today. Another important study that came out is that somebody did a study of wealth in Florence. So the Medicis, the 5 or 10 or 7 families that owned money during the height of the Medici rule are still the same families that hold the wealth. Of course, they no longer call themselves Medicis, but once you track it through the tax document, so the money, the capital, has always stayed within those 7 or 10 richest families, which means that the state has again stepped in from the height of the riches of Florence all the way to the present to make sure that the capital remains in the hands of a few people. And that is not untrue of the post colonies as well. So I think that is what will happen. I think we have to really reframe our understanding of the state has always been accountable. It's just that we've not named the state in very specific ways. And every time the state has been accountable, the accountability has been outsourced, which I think is also happening right now. And what then happens is a moment of immense opening, because crisis is always when people have pushed for change. The social contract. If you think about the social contract, why were some of the most, also the philosophers were people who came from wealth, right? Why all of a sudden are the people who are advising kings, who are scholars, who are thinkers, are coming up with ideas of the social contract? Why are Locke, Rousseau thinking about the social contract? They're thinking about the social contract not because they care about the citizen. They now have to manage power. If you're unwilling to relinquish power, what are the ways in which, what terms can you set in order for the state to hold certain power and also convince a citizen that this power actually means that the power is given to you? So if you look at this from the vision of management of state responsibility or state power, citizenship can actually be the struggle for the individual to constantly bargain power away from the state, and the state responding back to try and usurp it. And in that sense, I think we do have an opening in which, a very small opening, where the upheaval can be used to creatively demand a state of more accountability. It's a very small opening. And when it closes, what you will see is more hierarchization, certification of caste system in the case of India, despite whatever urban, you talk about this in your work as well. What you will see is the rich becoming more richer. What you'll see is a kleptocracy that's already in place becoming more powerful. Through the Aadhaar, you've already created AI infrastructures that are seen as A-neutral systems, but all trained to deprive people of that. So, and I think that is mostly what's happening. Sorry, I know I went on a long thing, but I spent a lot of time thinking through the question.
Well, this is one of those stories that I've been wanting to work on. To just pick up one village in this country, it doesn't matter which, but just to ask them that, okay, now tell me, how has your village changed between 2015 and 2020? It's a period that has seen demonetization, introduction of GST, and the slowdown that inspired, the cash crunch, COVID 1, COVID 2. And again, I would be very sure that we would see a bunch of households selling their assets like land. We would see a definite change in labor relations, caste relations, gender relations, people talking about education, all of that. A familiar pattern playing out. My question, I suppose, is that, what I fail to understand is the thinking of us, is what has changed for a state in a democratic, for a elected Indian government to think that it can get away with such wanton indifference towards human suffering and loss. In the past, these outbreaks have been isolated. Hashimpura, Nelly, whatever, where the scale was still smaller, it was violence inflicted on minorities. This time to actually have a state which has caused pain to pretty much everybody across the country. What is it that, how do I think through a state like this, which is able to sort of create such an outcome, right? That particular social contract about what is this new elected democratic state which thinks it can get away with such extraordinary incompetence and then even think of managing it? That is my question. I mean, what has happened to this particular state?
Yesterday I went back. I went back to your book where especially the part where you travel through the Northeast, and one of the things that came to me is when I'm just going to read out because I don't want to get this wrong. So when Mark Bloch talks about writes in his book Historian's Craft, he says that when he says men, he talks about historians. He says historians, no, the quote says men, but he's referring to historians. He says that men fail to change their vocabulary every time they change their custom. I think there's something to it. And I think we have failed to change our vocabulary every time the Indian state has done, accomplished, or enacted acts of egregious violations of the Constitution. Not just the Constitution, but the way it has used power. And again, this is not just the last 7 years, right? We really need to go back. You bring up Nelly, so I'm going to kind of try and read a section, read a quote. So Nelly appears in the book, and I went and spoke to photographer Bhavan Singh, who was one of the few photographers on the ground. After I did my fieldwork, I located him. Mr. Bhavan Singh is no longer. He also passed away during the COVID, and he talks about this moment when he's there. The Prime Minister Indira Gandhi arrives, and then he says, just give me a minute. So there is a reason for this reading this out is that So he says, when the prime minister at that time, Indira Gandhi, arrived, she was a bit shocked to see Bhavan there, waiting to photograph her. He said that the prime minister spent no more than 5 minutes in the devastated village before returning to the nearby field where a helicopter waited. Bhavan Singh, I'm quoting Mr. Bhavan Singh. I saw the most powerful people in the country who could have done the right thing do nothing. They treated the people who lost everything with so much disregard. They were annoyed that the dead bodies were laid out and photographed. But they had no empathy or decency to try and understand why this happened or what could have been done to stop this. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, when asked why she had not acted promptly to stop the violence during the Delhi massacre in 1983, replied, "One has to let such events take their own course before stepping in." So I think it's very important for us to first understand that this is not the first time the Indian state has not been held accountable for what it has done. There is a long history of abdication of responsibility to govern, willful violation of the constitution. And I'm not just talking about the emergency, right? Emergency is, again, Professor Gyan Prakash talks about the emergency not as an exception, but already the kernels of fascism as already being embedded in the Indian constitution. He talks about this in his book, but he also talks about it in a larger sense, is that foundations of that authoritarian fascist centralizing capacity is already there in the founding documents. He makes a case for that. So one has to see this both as a process, but also how is this time different from the other? So one thing is that we have to see it as a larger process. You abdicate your responsibility to govern over and over again, and the state will relinquish you of it. For instance, long before Article 370, it was under the Congress, under Mr. P. Chidambaram, who the first mobile phone bans happened. Mobile phone text messages being blocked, right? In 2010, if I'm not mistaken. Photographer Alana Hunt has this phenomenal thing where instead of the text messages, she turns them into postcards. I'm going on a tangent, but so in that sense, long before the mass FIRs are filed in Uttar Pradesh, Kudangulam, you have mass FIRs being filed, right? In one of the most so-called Dravidian progressive states, in the sense that we need to be very clear and have the moral clarity to very specifically call out state's abdication of its responsibility, but with a very specific eye at the local historical political context. So one is that the state abdication of responsibility has been going on for a really long time. Now, that itself does not explain the present. The present is a continuation of the past, but the present is also in some ways different. This amount and level of state abdication or state, no, I don't even want to call it abdication. I do not know. I don't think we have the language. I don't think we've cultivated the language. And that's why I started with quoting Mark Bloch when he says that men fail to understand. We are still using language of state abdication. We are still using responsibility, accountability. I think we are well past that. I don't even know what this moment is. What
We're
language?
talking complicity. We're talking complicity
Yeah.
in a genocide.
Yes, absolutely. But the complicity in genocide also needs a little bit more context, because if you go tell somebody on the street, this is complicity in genocide, they're going to look around you and they're going to turn around and say, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah.
Because we've also not trained, we've also not prepared our populations by not reporting what's happening, because this has to be done in a consistent way, right? We need to understand why 2014 happened. We don't know why 2014 happened, because by 2005, we forgot what happened in 2002.
Yeah.
By 2002, we forgot what happened in 1983. So in that sense, we have not prepared. I think this is where I would very squarely put a lot of blame in the editors and the journalists and the language of reporting, is that we have failed to educate. And this is both, some vernacular medias do a slightly better job of it. We failed to prepare our communities, our populations, our people to understand if you go say complicity in genocide, when Arundhati Roy wrote her thing about war crimes, there's a lot of response saying, what the hell is she talking about? We have not prepared, forget complicity, we have not even used the word accountability, right? So I think we are in a moment where something has changed. It's not just institutional capture, it is something else. And I think I do not, as I said, I write to make sense of the social world. And I think this moment is going to take at least years for us to understand why this happened. Something has changed. And I don't want to say we, perhaps India already has pundits who know this. I don't. I think we need to understand. I think we need to evolve a language that is very particular, that's very precise, that has moral and ethical clarity to make sense of this. But something has gone wrong. It is not just that the state has failed, but for example, I just saw the Outlook cover. It says missing government of India. I'm like, is that the language? Is the government of India actually missing?
No.
Right? So you're also using the language of the past. The government of India went missing in 2014. It didn't go missing today. We are using Hindutva now. Hindutva happened in the 1980s and 90s. Like Hindutva's real emergence happens in the 90s. And in almost 30 years later, we are talking about Hindutva. So I think that is also an important, language is important, right? Because that's how we make sense of our moral, political, social worlds. I think we need a new language, and I think we really need ground reporting. We need to understand what's happening. We need to understand how these structures were allowed. If you're going to create an oxygen station for cows in Uttar Pradesh, it didn't happen today. If you're going to create IDs for cows and cattle in India's border, why would you need an ID for a cattle? It didn't happen today. It happened over a long period of time. But to get to this moment, I think there is gaps in our own reporting history. There is gaps in our historical memory. There's also ideological gap, right? In terms of humans are messy. We're all affected by our political ideological positions. So I think that's where we are. I think I need a little bit more time to make sense of this.
Right. So Venkat now wants us to move into the Q&As. So Venkat, over to you. He's looking suitably traumatized right now.
We did this in the other talk as well. And then remember, by the time Rajshekhar and I were done talking, what was the journalist's name, Rajshekhar? Who interviewed us?
Nitin,
Nitin,
of
yeah,
News Minute.
Yeah, Nitin is like always like smiling. By the time we were done with our talk, Nitin looked so traumatized. He just stopped smiling. So Venkat is still smiling, so that's a good thing. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. I'm just going to pull in some Q&A because I thought it'd be nice to get a couple of these questions that have come up, and there are a whole lot of people also watching us on YouTube. I'm going to call on Siddharth, if it's possible, to go ahead and voice his comment and question. Siddharth, if you could do that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, you might just need to speak a little louder.
All right. Great. So that was really fascinating, Suchitra, although I wouldn't say I'm really happy. I'm quite traumatized, to be honest. But I think that was the intended effect. So I want to ask you that you very eloquently described how our stories tend to evolve over time because of a variety of reasons, but also as a form of a survival mechanism. So could you comment on the role such survival tendencies play in our collective denial of events in our history, and also the subsequent rewriting of our history, and what are the downstream implications of that? So I was very curious to know what you thought about that.
Yeah, sure. I'm so sorry, Siddharth. My intention was not to traumatize anyone. I think the country is already traumatized in enough ways.
No, I think these are important things that we should be talking about more. So,
you know what? I'm okay. So one of the things that I found when I was writing this book was people said two things. One, I would walk away from these conversations, and then the younger members of the society, of the family, would say things like, "Oh, I've never heard of the story. He never said this to me. Or she never said this to me." So in one part of it was just that people never, there was no I always thought in my head, I was born and raised in Madras. We didn't go through the trauma of partition the way that a lot of the communities um, in Punjab and Bengal had, or even the communities in Kashmir have been going through now for years. In my head, I always assumed that partition histories and stories were kept alive. They were passed on. That there was a sense of rich culture of memory and remembering and passing on. I was very shocked to find out that even those who have survived the partition, of course, in the last 8 years, many that I've spoken to have also passed away. Many of them were already in the 80s and 90s. Was that we did not pass on the memories or the lived experiences. There was not enough time to heal, right? One is the act of once you migrate and you've lost everything else, telling stories become important to you when you had a little bit of time. Most communities became refugees, they had to find livelihood, right? Like you are thinking about food, you're thinking about protection, you're thinking about entire families died. Women were brutally raped across religions, across communities. So survival becomes important in terms of living. Another dear friend of mine, Ritesh Uttamchandani, his parents are Sindhis, the young people who migrated when they were very young when they moved. He said something very similar. He never heard about the stories of migration. He never heard about the community because the parents just said, you know what, it's a new life, we're not going to start. So often the history that you, even when you come from a family that has gone through all of this or any kind of violence, there is no sense of passing on things. That's true of my family as well. Recently, a few years ago, I mean, very recently, something had happened, and my mother springs a story upon me, which I had never heard growing up, because I had had a very, very different idea of who we also tend to, the sense of nostalgia, elegic, that we do. The story that was told is that, there was a famine, we lost everything, we came to Madras. Again, things were very difficult. They really struggled hard, and finally, that was a story that was told to you, right? But that story is so linear, and that's not how those stories happen. And my mother springs a story upon me saying that at one point before she was born, my grandfather had lost all of the money in the presidency of Madras, and then had already 3 or 4 kids, one son, I think 3 daughters then, and there was no money. And at one point in time, he tells my grandmother that, you know what, let's go. They used to live in Paris Corner, or Chintatripet, as it's called, Triplicane and Chintatripet area. And he tells my grandmother, apparently, let's go take the kids to the ocean. Let's kill ourselves, right? I was like, what? And then apparently my grandmother told him that, excuse me, please get lost. You want to go kill yourself, you go kill yourself. I am going to do whatever it takes. And again, whatever it takes then meant that there's a lot of history of sexual violence that happens during pandemics when people move. She says, I'm going to do whatever it takes to take care of the kids. You go kill yourself. And that moment when my mom narrates the story to me, I'm already in my 30s listening to this. And that moment of break, right? All of a sudden, I'm now seeing my grandfather not as this man who left the thing, who came here, who struggled really hard. No, people, and that moment, if my grandmother had said, yes, I wouldn't exist today, right? In that sense, survival also means that we need to pass on to our children a better version of ourselves, a better story, a better standard, which also means that often those stories tend to go in the direction of the state mythologization of history. Stories of people making it all the way to Delhi from Lahore and Hyderabad in Pakistan and restarting something new, holding on to remnants of a past and nostalgia. But in reality, as my friend Asim said, we killed our neighbors and danced on their bodies. And this was a Holocaust, no less. And I think that has profound effects in this way we see ourselves. I no longer see my grandfather as this great guy who worked really hard. I see him as a very flawed human being. I actually see my grandmother as a feminist icon who basically said no, who couldn't educate the first 3 of her daughters, despite coming from the privileges of caste and class, because the daughters were not allowed to go, but then struggled and managed to get my mother educated and sent her to law school, right? So all of a sudden, It's not my grandfather who did it. For me, I am recasting my grandmother as a feminist icon who fought for her children to live, who was willing to say that I'm going to do whatever it took to make my kids survive. And I think sometimes those survivals, it's not about, again, I don't think of them as lies. I don't think of them as remaking. I think of them as survival. And this is a conversation that Rajshekar and I have had, is that we talk about resilience, right? About how we are so resilient, we fight. It's also, resilience is also outsourcing state culpability. Sometimes people are not resilient. Sometimes we break. Sometimes we don't make it. And when we don't make it, it has repercussions. And I think the Natasha Javed chapter in the book is very telling. One act of killing in Jallianwala Bagh makes a woman, a young Muslim woman, a widow, who then has to depend on patriarchy. And then the partition happens. And because of partition, they move. And because of these patriarchal restrictions, there's an act of sexual violence that happens. That then fundamentally makes all of these women, all of them have crossed not one but multiple boundaries. But again, it starts with Jallianwala Bagh, right? Act of this one young man getting killed, making his entire family orphaned, who then are in the middle of a great upheaval of nationalism, new nation states being born, and then they migrate. And that migration is also leads to an act of sexual violence that then is inherited. And it takes 4 generations for these women to even make sense of that. And all of a sudden, you're not just a liberal, secular, Lahori, Pakistani family, you're a family that is trying to struggle with it, who's also lost his history. And there's this one beautiful line when Natasha says, my history. So Natasha's family are Kashmiris who moved to Amritsar in the early part of the century, who then again migrate to Lahore. And she says that my history is in Amritsar. My grandfather dies in Jallianwala Bagh, a Kashmiri who moves to Amritsar, who turns up for the protest, who gets shot. But if I now identify myself with Amritsar and the history of Jallianwala Bagh, what will Pakistan think of me? Pakistan will call me a traitor. So all of a sudden, and again, Natasha doesn't find out about her great grandfather being killed in Jallianwala Bagh till in her 30s, when her mother just all of a sudden just says, oh, that is because their grandfather was killed. And all of a sudden you're putting these puzzles and pieces. And I think that is what it is. And I don't know what today we will tell of this moment to our grandchildren. What will we tell our grandchildren of, are we going to talk about the leadership of the country? Are we going to talk about the people who helped us, who saved us, who betrayed us? People who are now charging 1,500 rupees for a vaccine? What will we tell, right? So a lot will also be lost. And I think that's why it becomes important as historians, as journalists, as writers, as photographers, to try and document all of this so that even if family histories are lost, some history somewhere can be kind of pulled into it.
Thanks, Suchitra. Thanks, Azad, for the question. In the interest of time, I think what we'll do is we'll take 3. There's one question from Jyotsna, and I'd request Jyotsna to go ahead and unmute yourself if you can to ask your question out. And we'll follow that with a comment from Pavitra, who's one of the hosts, and then a question from Sanjana. So, Jyotsna.
Thank you so much. Wonderful talk. I just need to ask, what in your opinion prompts people who have personally been affected by this wave of the pandemic and the devastation it has unleashed to still hold on to ideological beliefs and their allegiance to the parties in power and the state and continue to defend it to an extent that they call out and attack people who critique the state and its complicity in genocide?
I don't know. I don't know. The answer is I don't know. This is a question that I struggle with too. And it's okay to say I don't know, because I think not knowing perhaps gives you the capacity to look in places for answers that one might not. I think this goes back to my balkanization comment in early 2013, is that even in early 2013, I noticed 2 things. One, the sense of community, people were drawing, say you should draw a circle around you, right? And that circle includes your family, your friends, your community, the people. That sense of line, the circle that we all draw around, this is metaphorical circle, not metaphorical, sorry. This imaginary circles of belongings that we draw around ourselves. That was already beginning to kind of shrink. And it has shrunk for a really long time. And you could see this very specifically in communities affected by trauma, especially in Gujarat, especially as I traveled through Assam. There are entire villages that are now self-segregating. Not that they're very far away, they would literally be a 10 minutes walking distance from the main Barapita main road. But imagine if you're a village that is 10 minutes away from the main road that connects you to all of the commercial things in Assam, but you don't go out unless it's absolutely essential for you. And the last time the state came to see you was also 5 years ago when a flood happened and the entire village was swallowed in. So that sense of self-segregation or was already, you can see that. Rajshekhar in his book talks about this as well, and how being an Adarsh member of a society, you can't just give houses for this person of the same caste, it has to be the subcaste and all of that. So that sense of self-segregation, this lines of circles of belonging that we were drawing was already shrinking quite rapidly. And this started much before, and I was already seeing that in early 2013. And as we shrink, and in the book, one of the gentlemen that I spoke to says, these borders have made us, he talked about the metaphorical border of, these borders have made us petty, narrow people, we've made us, and he says, as someone who grew up in Sindh, he says, I spoke Sindhi, Farsi, Punjabi. The food that I ate was not the Punjabi food. The food I ate was influenced by the Sindhi culture, Hindu Sindhis and Muslims. And he says, now all of that is gone. He says that, Farsi is dead and Urdu has been ghettoized here. And then he says that Sindhi has been ghettoized in Pakistan. So he says that these lines have made us narrow, petty people. So the sense of this shrinking of our identities have been happening for a really long time. It's not new. Along with it, I think there's been an active way in which our communities, entire societies have been, this is misinformation, propaganda. I was very surprised when I was sitting in a relative's house by marriage, and all of a sudden my partner's aunt starts saying, "Oh my God, what about Hindu trauma? What about our genocide?" And I looked at her and I said, "In your lifetime, what genocide have you gone through?" It really didn't make sense to me, because their family's from Trichy, my dad's family's from Trichy. I'm trying to make sense of what genocide is it that she is talking about. And I said, "What are you talking about?" And she's, of course, an older person. And I was, and then she says, "Yeah, they've sacked our temples." I'm like, in your lifetime, and at least 4 generations above in our lifetime, that is not the history. And I also said, what about Tipu Sultan, doing the thing with the Shankaracharya Mutt? And I said, what about the Marathas who sacked the Tirupati temple? All of a sudden she looks at me and she says, "What are you talking about?" And then she says, and then they say these things, and then she said something like, "Oh, I have Muslim friends too, but Hindus are not terrorists, only Muslims are terrorists." And these are things that we are now saying in our living rooms. Perhaps it's been happening for a really long time, but for me, just listening to that was that, and the uncle in the house says, "Oh, this happens in Kashmir, that happens in Kashmir." And then I tell him, "Look, I've worked on Kashmir since 2014, which is now almost 6 years. Are you telling me that your WhatsApp forward of what you're reading about Kashmir is more authentic than someone who, as a lawyer, as a researcher, who has certain skills, who studies a region?" And I'm still trying to understand where that moment of indoctrination, of course we say WhatsApp universities, fake news, but there's more to that, right? So already prejudice was there. And I think we should not discount the fact that India has always been a deeply divided hierarchical society. Caste plays far more role. And increasingly I begin, I should acknowledge the fact that this is not something that I taught about even 6 or 7 years ago. I think caste and the way in which our societies are deeply divided, even for many of us in the urban areas who claim that caste no longer plays. I think if caste segregates, I think it also segregates our histories. And I think it's a bit of both. And I'm just beginning to think through these ideas. But in answering the larger question, no, I don't know. I don't know what is making them defend it. Recently, I got an email from someone who just was a very staunch believer and follower of the current dispensation, who also had a long history of harassing young women online on social media, especially calling them liptards, secular, your mother is this, your mother is that. And again, this is a gentleman who is a father of a child, a young girl, and he wrote this thing about how the family recuperated from the COVID. And finally, he says, thank God we were saved. Not the medical facility, not acknowledgement that you got this before the wave, which meant that if you had gotten this 2 weeks later, you wouldn't have gotten the bed. No acknowledgement of the fact that you are a highly educated upper caste, upper class Brahmin man with a lot of disposable income, with access to power and social networks that could get you a bed, that you had money and resources to have food cooked and delivered to your home. And then it says, thank God, it's God's grace that, and again, the correlation causation is off. Again, as I said, it's not just people who go through trauma who retell stories. And I'm sure in 10 years from now, all of them who supported this dispensation, including immense violence to be inflicted on minorities and others, will also change their stories. And that's again, now the question is, I think, for us to make sense of why this is happening, have better explanation for this. I haven't, the explanation I've given you is not enough, and I think more has to be done on that.
Thank you for the question, Jyotsna, and thanks, Suchitra. I want to switch to a comment or a question from Pavitra, who's also the host for the session. Pavitra?
Hi, Suchitra. Thanks so much. I think you joined so many dots that I mean, like my brain was just going boom, 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 kind of. And I wanted to ask, I mean, some of these are very helpful, but also horrible insights in another way, right? So, I mean, the state versus people question I felt kept coming up, right? That the people, who are being affected and all of that, and the whole terrorism thing by the state, right? So what you see now is that people are stepping up in their individual capacities as much as they can, but um, at the same time they don't have much power, right? Like you said missing in action and everything, and even the National Students Union file a case saying this person is missing, like the home minister is missing, where is he, right? But um, what an individual can do is limited. But as an individual working within the state structure, so to speak, how do you delineate, right? Because I mean, I'm not talking about like someone with a lot of power, but whatever, like a normal government employee, right? How do you delineate between that individual and the state?
Um, I think it goes back to our earlier conversation. I think one, we need to educate our society, and I think I had to educate myself to understand what citizenship is, what right is. And so individually we might feel, so the state does two things, right? So the state has now outsourced the responsibility of a state to individuals. 2 weeks ago, when the height of the pandemic, I was on the calls regularly trying, because you're seeing this number, you want to respond, you want to feel helpful. It's also very selfish because you feel a sense of, I felt a sense of dread. And I was on the phone for I was on the phone from 9 in the morning till about 7 in the evening. Some requests kept coming. There's some, I mean, again, I didn't do much. I barely did anything. I was simply just connecting a few people here and there, but it's the kids on the ground who were doing all of the work. Remarkable. Just remarkable in terms of how much they took on, and they did. But end of that week, almost 80% of the people we wanted to try and help either had passed away or something had happened to them. And it became very clear that even someone like me who theorizes on state and citizenship, and I realized how easily we were all tricked into outsourcing the state's complicity, accountability into individuals. Individuals are now responsible for what the state must have done. And of course, we're going to fail because we don't have the resources, we don't have the structure, we don't have the capacity. And it feels like a personal failure, not the failure of the state. And despite knowing that, I kept doing this for the next a few weeks. I still do it, but it's still now I know that I need to take a break because otherwise my hair, which was already gone white, is going to be completely white. Rajshekar will say I can't see any white hair, but there is a lot of white hair, trust me. I transgress. The point is, the state has made it very easy for individuals or outsource the responsibility, the accountability, the duty to individuals, and we have become bad at demanding what was ours. Because we have never been good at demanding what is ours. We are good at so many other things. We are good at pointing out, we're saying that the state should not do it. We have to demand of the state. The state is never going, if you look at the genealogy of the state as I was created, in my opinion, and my belief, and my theorization, the state was never created to serve the citizen. The state was created to mediate the power so that the citizen is always a little behind in terms of his rights, which means the history of modern freedom, liberation, and movement is always testing more. The modern state did not give women the right to vote. It did not give Black people the right to vote. It did not give us, it still doesn't give us fair wages. It still doesn't give women equal wages. It hasn't abolished, while on constitutional paper, we've abolished caste. We have not really abolished caste in the real sense. The state is never going to give you your dignity or your rights, even the ones that the Constitution is guaranteed. It's for us to constantly demand it. And again, that is a structural handicap where we're constantly demanding. Individually, yes, one might feel we don't have power, but I think Shaheen Bagh taught us something. On the street, the state is always afraid of the people. On the street, we are powerful. Individually, we might feel powerless, but together we are immensely powerful. How else is it that my grandfather was a subject of a colonial state and I was born as an independent, rights-bearing citizen of a democratic secular republic? We forget what a revolutionary constitution that Ambedkar gave us, and it did not happen easily. Imperfect, yes, revolutionary nonetheless. Same constitution was used to oppress the people in Kashmir, continues to oppress, ASFA, the other things, PSA. Our democratic constitution is not democratic or revolutionary for the Kashmiris or the Manipuris or those in Nagaland. Yes, despite that, the idea that people who had less than the right to call themselves half human were all of a sudden given the right. So in that sense, testing it is important. That's why Shaheen Bagh is important. That's why the farmers' protest is important. That's why any person who speaks up is important. We are powerful. We should never concede that power. And that's what we should do. We should organize, we should mobilize. There's a reason when you say educate, agitate, organize. And I think that's very, very important. And this is not about being an activist. Okay. And that's another language that I really want people to stop thinking. Everybody's an activist, because if we don't fight for what is ours, we are going to be denied that. And I think that is very important for us to remember. Individually, it's very easy for us to feel powerless because that's the structural handicap of the state. The state will make you feel powerless. They'll make you stand in line to get your ID card. It'll make you stand in line. Your bank account will not work without Aadhaar. That's the state's building in the structural handicap. But we are powerful. Look what, I mean, I'm saying Shaheen Bagh, the moment of Great Depression, I was, when the judgments were coming through, and something happened after the CAA and RC. Rajshekar and I remember having this conversation with him. I was like, why is it that nothing happened after the Babri judgment? But something happened, people took, and Shaheen Bagh was, and imagine what it took to shut down Shaheen Bagh. The Feb 23rd violence. Look what they've done. The state was so afraid, they picked up Natasha Narwal. Look what they did to her. It's painful to see that Mr. Mahavir Narwal go through what he did. But a weak state is afraid of that young girl. That's what they did. They're afraid of Anand Teltumde. They're afraid of Hani Babu. They're afraid of Stan Swami. What does it mean? We are powerful. That's why they're all picked up. You are so afraid of a girl that you will not even allow her to go see her father. So we have that inherent power. And again, this is not the language of activism. This is the language of us trying to fight for dignity. And that connects back to the question in the book, is that can we imagine a better society? Because this way we live right now cannot go on. And I think that is fundamental to all of this, that to think of the future and to think of ways in which we can build a better society. You and I don't have to even agree on what that better society is, but we have to agree that the present is not okay and build ways to think about citizenship, rights, our public spaces. Our children don't have public spaces where they can go safely play. We can't walk on the street without feeling violated. Aren't those things part of citizenship? Aren't our body's autonomy part of citizenship? So I think those are all things that we should. And no, we are in, I mean, some days it's, hope is also a discipline. You have to train yourself to be hopeful every day. But no, I think we might feel powerless, but collectively we are immensely powerful. And that's why the state constantly keeps doing it. They refuse to give us space to protest. They pick us up. It took almost a sense of immense violence in the 23rd Feb, the response to the Shaheen Bagh to destroy it, right? So what that tells us is that we are, as collectively, far more powerful than the state. I hope that was helpful. And again, I'm not saying this as a rhetoric. I genuinely mean this.
Thank you. We could talk about this quite a bit. Sanjana, I think you do have a question. It might have been addressed a little bit, but go ahead. We'll wrap up with your question.
Yeah, I think mine is, okay, I'm just going to ask it anyway. We'll see. Hello, thank you for your talk, Suchitra and Rajshekar. I'm Sanjana, and I'm just a student. A lot of the questions on how we must make sense of violence and suffering and how we must make sense of violence that's happening on the ground are the same questions that have motivated me to kind of look at anthropology of violence and how that discipline maybe is making sense of this. Now, I agree with you that the state is responsible and must be held accountable. But one of the questions that I keep getting stuck at is how must we define the state in order to name it? Because I see I see people around me experiencing the state or encountering the state in very, very, very varied ways. And in some ways, this question aligns to what Pavitra was saying, but how must we then define or name the state that is experienced in so many different ways by the people? And what happens when, and so I just like to know your thoughts on how is it that we must go about this complicated task of defining what or who is the state? And I think, and I want to know your thoughts on whether you see a need for dialogues between people working in maybe like the ivory towers of academia, sitting and trying to define these things in a very theoretical way, disconnected from what's happening on the ground, and how do we foster a dialogue between academia, journalists, activists, artists, to kind of deal with this question of how should we define and name the state if we are to name it and hold it accountable. Thank you. I think you're on mute, maybe.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, my first advice is I would tell someone to stay very far away with academia and ivory towers and Ivy Leagues. As someone who's occupied and been in these spaces, I can tell you that most of them have no sense of what's happening. Again, most of them don't, some do. So I think for me, the first shock was how ivory towers, anybody who claims to give you answers, policymakers, political consultants, anyone who comes from a place and says, I will tell you what has to be done, is someone you have to stay far away from. simply because often it's never the case, because a social world transforms. And again, I'm going back to Mark Bloch's thing, is that we need to find the language, and that language in our social worlds transform all the time. So defining the state, when I talk about defining the state, naming the beast, none of this is academic. None of this is anthro. None of this is about the academia. None of this is about. Fanon was a doctor who wrote about the predicament of his people. James Baldwin wrote about his people. Plato actually didn't write philosophy. Plato wrote drama. He wrote conversations. That is true of anybody who's tried to make sense of a social world. They were trying to make sense of their reality, social political realities, and find ways to confront the act of oppression. Sometimes the act of oppression happens as a state, sometimes as an individual, sometimes a structure, sometimes an agency. So I would think about, I mean, in this case, the state has a presence, and while we've spoken about the state because we are also responding to the present moment as COVID, I would think about naming the act of oppression, the structures of oppression, and those responsible for maintaining and enabling and aiding and abetting the acts of oppression. That is always a much better way of thinking. Because victims can also become oppressors. A community that went through the Holocaust is today rejoicing the disempowerment and disenfranchisement of another community. So what state will you name? Because the state of Israel didn't exist. The state of Israel didn't exist before the Holocaust, right? So I think one should stay away from academia in the sense that what I would instead, in the place of academia, use is think of the word as knowledge. When I was a young person and 9/11 was happening, I didn't need academia. I needed someone who understood my social reality to explain that to me. Of course, Edward Said and Iqbal Ahmed, and both of them had academic positions, but Iqbal Ahmed wrote about his people. He wrote about the empire. He wrote about terrorism, yours and ours and yours, right? Terrorism, I'm getting the title wrong. The point I'm saying is that these were men and women who were responding to the social realities of making sense of their oppression. They were naming the oppression, the structures of oppression, people responsible. And that is an ongoing process. And that is something that one has to consistently do. Sometimes at the risk of naming sometimes our very own friends who are complicit in all of this. I think that is the way I would think about it. For me, it doesn't matter. I mean, some of the smartest people I know are not Ivy League educated academics. Some of the smartest people I know are people who work on the ground. Some of them also happen to be academics, but academia is a way for them to articulate themselves. So I think it's very important for us to place what we're doing. Today, for me, someone like Meera Sangamitra, who's an activist on the ground, has far more political sensibility and understanding of the people than anyone else. Listen to them. Again, we should not put people on pedestal, right? The idea is for us to make sense of the social reality. And then when we do that, and I think that's a much better way. And also, we bring together people who do different things, but eventually an artist or an academic or we are all citizens, we are all people. When I say citizens, I'm not saying citizenship in relationship to the state. We are all individuals who come with a certain inalienable right. The state should not give me the rights of citizenship. I have the right to freedom, dignity, and liberty because I was born. No document has to enshrine that right to me. No state can take away that right or enshrine that right to me. And that is what we're fighting for. A piece of paper cannot tell me that I have rights. I have the right of dignity, freedom, and liberty because I was born. Everybody born has that, independent of whether they are brilliant, not brilliant, good, bad, academic, scholar, where they are born, what predicaments they come with. That is the guiding document, and everything comes from that. So that's what I would do. And I think state itself is such, again, when you say state, it can mean anything it means so many things. I mean, sociologists cannot agree with political scientists, and political scientists cannot agree with IR folks, and IR folks cannot agree with anthropologists, and anthropologists cannot agree with Foucauldian postmodernists. So, no, yeah, you need to do it, and we all need to do that exercise, and that's where I would leave it.
Thank you, Sanjana. Thank you for the question. I do hope we can continue this conversation. I'm actually quite glad, Suchitra and Rajshekar, for that we went in the direction of the genealogy of the state and thinking about it. Only to say that if all goes well, we will be touching upon that topic in a couple of months in the lecture series. So it'll be really nice to sort of connect back to this conversation that we just had. To the 50 odd people who are still here, almost 2 hours into the conversation, thank you so much. Suchitra, I can't thank you guys enough for sort of articulating, as Rajshekar said so well right in the beginning, of bringing clarity to some of these questions. So thank you to both of you. If you like the lecture series, do sort of tune in next month, which will be June 17th, which is a Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, where we will be touching upon a very different topic, but perhaps still pertinent in these times, which is looking at the morality of doing good. We're going to be touching upon the histories and the politics of the do-gooder, as it were. And so, if you can, do join us for that conversation with Larissa McFarter, the author of the book Strangers Drowning. With that said,